October 2022 marked the shocking end for Leona Thatcher, a powerful real estate mogul whose lifeless body was discovered in her opulent Manhattan penthouse, leaving behind a chilling mystery of control, obsession, and murder. Leona Thatcher, at the age of 54, was a woman who seemed to have it all. Her name was synonymous with success in the cutthroat world of New York City real estate. Leona had built an empire from nothing, rising from humble beginnings to owning some of the most sought-after properties in the city. Her penthouse, perched high above the bustling streets, was a testament to her wealth and taste. A sprawling space filled with modern art, sleek furniture, and an endless view of the city skyline. But despite all her achievements, Leona was lonely. Her personal life was a series of failed marriages and fleeting relationships. She had been married 3 times, each ending in bitter divorces that left her more cynical about love and more determined to control everything in her life. Leona was not someone who easily trusted others. She had learned long ago that trust often led to disappointment. Instead, she kept her relationships on her terms, never allowing anyone to get too close. Then came Lucas Hayes, a 23-year-old aspiring actor from a small town in West Virginia. Lucas had come to New York with dreams of making it big in the acting world. But like many before him, he found the city unforgiving. He struggled to land roles, and the pressure of city life began to take its toll. He was broke, living in a tiny rundown apartment, and on the verge of giving up when he met Leona. Their meeting was pure chance. Lucas had managed to get into a high-end cocktail party, hoping to make some connections. The room was filled with powerful people, producers, directors, and of course, Leona. When Leona saw Lucas, she was immediately struck by his youthful charm and the vulnerability that seemed to lie just beneath the surface. Lucas was different from the polished, confident men she usually encountered. He was raw, untapped potential, and she saw an opportunity to mold him into something more. For Lucas, meeting Leona was like stepping into another world. She was sophisticated, successful, and offered him everything he had ever wanted: a way out of his struggles, a life of luxury, and a chance to be someone. When Leona proposed a relationship that was more of an arrangement, she would provide for him, and in return he would be her companion. Lucas eagerly agreed. For a while, the arrangement worked perfectly. Leona took Lucas under her wing, introducing him to her world of wealth and influence. She enrolled him in acting classes, bought him designer clothes, and even used her connections to get him minor roles in independent films. Lucas was captivated by her power and sophistication, while Leona enjoyed showing off her young lover to her elite social circle. They attended galas, art openings, and high-end dinners, always appearing as the perfect couple. But beneath the surface, Leona was beginning to tighten her grip on Lucas. But soon it became clear that Lucas was not just another project for Leona. As the months passed, Leona's need for control grew stronger. What began as a mutually beneficial relationship quickly became something much darker. Leona started dictating every aspect of Lucas's life: what roles he should take, who he should socialize with, even how he should dress. Lucas, initially eager to please, started to feel suffocated by her possessiveness. Leona was not someone who took kindly to losing control. She had fought too hard to get where she was, and she wasn't about to let anyone slip through her fingers. When she learned about Lucas's troubled past, his struggles with depression, a stint in rehab, she saw a way to keep him even more tightly bound to her. She began to use this information to manipulate him emotionally, reminding him how she had saved him from a life of obscurity and how he owed everything to her. Lucas, who had once been so grateful for Leona's support, now felt trapped. The walls of the gilded cage Leona had built around him were closing in, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't break free. He started to withdraw, spending more time away from Leona and reconnecting with old friends. But this only made Leona more paranoid. She began to monitor his every move, hiring private investigators to follow him and installing surveillance equipment in their home, all under the guise of protecting their relationship. But the more Leona tried to control Lucas, the more he slipped away. The breaking point came when Leona uncovered a secret from Lucas's past that she believed would give her the ultimate leverage. Through her network of private investigators, she learned about an incident from Lucas's teenage years, a car accident that resulted in the death of a friend. The accident had been covered up, but Leona now had the evidence that could ruin Lucas's life. When Leona confronted Lucas with the information, he was devastated. This was something he had tried to bury, something that had haunted him for years. And now Leona was using it to control him, to keep him under her thumb. Lucas felt as if he was drowning, with no way out. The once vibrant, ambitious young man had become a shadow of his former self, his spirit crushed by Leona's manipulation. But Leona's victory was hollow. She had won, but at what cost? The love and passion that had once existed between them were gone, replaced by bitterness and fear. The atmosphere in their home became unbearable, with both of them constantly on edge. But the storm that had been brewing for months was about to break. It was a stormy night in early October, the kind of night that felt like it had been ripped from the pages of a Gothic novel. The wind howled through the streets, and the rain battered the windows of Leona's penthouse. Inside, the tension between Leona and Lucas had reached its boiling point. Leona, driven by paranoia, had decided to follow Lucas, convinced that he was meeting someone else. She tracked his location using the hidden GPS she had installed on his phone weeks earlier. Her suspicions were confirmed when she spotted Lucas at an upscale restaurant, sharing an intimate dinner with Isla Monroy, a rising starlet who had recently been cast as Lucas's co-star in a new film. The chemistry between Lucas and Isla was undeniable, both on and off the screen, and rumors about their relationship had already begun to circulate. Leona watched from a distance, her anger growing with each passing second. She could feel her control slipping away, and it terrified her. Unable to contain herself any longer, Leona stormed into the restaurant, causing a scene that shocked everyone present. She accused Lucas of betrayal, her voice shaking with rage. Lucas, humiliated and furious, dragged Leona outside, where they had a vicious argument on the rain-soaked street. Isla, stunned by the spectacle, watched from inside as Lucas shoved Leona into a waiting black Mercedes, their figures disappearing into the night. But the storm that raged outside was nothing compared to the one brewing inside Leona's penthouse. Back at the penthouse, the argument between Lucas and Leona reached a new level of intensity. Leona, desperate to hold on to the one thing she had left, Lucas revealed her final card. She pulled out the evidence of Lucas's past crime and waved it in his face, threatening to destroy him if he dared to leave her. Her threats were a twisted mix of love and control as she painted a picture of Lucas's life ruined without her protection. But Lucas was done. The fear that had once kept him compliant was gone, replaced by a cold, steely resolve. He told Leona that he didn't care anymore, that he would rather go to prison than spend another day under her control. This declaration shattered Leona's carefully constructed world. In a moment of blind rage, she grabbed a heavy crystal paperweight from her desk and swung it at Lucas with all her strength. The struggle that followed was brutal. The elegant penthouse, once a symbol of Leona's success, was transformed into a battlefield. Furniture was overturned, glass was shattered, and the walls, once pristine, were now marked with the evidence of their fight. In the heat of the moment, Lucas shoved Leona away, not realizing the force of his action. She stumbled backward, her heel catching on the edge of a Persian rug. Time seemed to slow as Leona fell, her head striking the sharp corner of a marble coffee table. The sound of the impact was drowned out by a sudden clap of thunder as the storm outside reached its peak. But the storm was not the only thing that would leave a mark. For a moment, everything was still. Lucas stood frozen, staring in horror at Leona's lifeless body, lying in a pool of blood on the floor. The reality of what had just happened crashed down on him, but his mind was already racing with thoughts of self-preservation. He knew that if he stayed, he would be blamed for Leona's death. In a daze, he began to clean up the scene, wiping down surfaces, gathering the broken pieces of glass, and carefully placing the crystal paperweight back on the desk as if it had never been touched. Lucas's meticulousness gave him a false sense of security. He believed that by erasing his presence, he could avoid suspicion entirely. He even went so far as to stage the scene to look like a burglary gone wrong, scattering valuable items around the room and leaving the door slightly ajar. His final act was to retrieve the surveillance footage from Leona's hidden cameras, which he deleted, confident that no one would ever connect him to the crime. But in his panicked state, Lucas overlooked one crucial detail, a tiny speck of blood that had splattered onto the underside of Leona's desk. It was nearly invisible, but it was there, a small, damning piece of evidence that would later prove to be his undoing. With the scene set, Lucas fled the penthouse, disappearing into the night. He retreated to a secluded cabin in upstate New York, a place he and Leona had once visited together in happier times. He believed he was safe, cut off from the world and the reach of law enforcement. The storm continued to rage outside, mirroring the storm of emotions inside Lucas as he grappled with the enormity of what he had done. But the guilt was more than Lucas had anticipated. Alone in the cabin, he found himself replaying the events of that night over and over in his mind. The isolation only amplified his anxiety, and soon he began to fear that every sound outside was the police coming to arrest him. He barely slept, his mind racing with thoughts of how he could have done things differently. The days passed slowly, each one feeling like an eternity. Lucas tried to distract himself, but nothing could take his mind off what had happened. The once serene cabin now felt like a prison, its quietness oppressive. He avoided the news, terrified that he might see his own face staring back at him from the screen. He knew he had to keep a low profile, but the isolation was driving him to the edge. Meanwhile, back in Manhattan, Leona's body was discovered by her housekeeper, who immediately called the police. The initial investigation pointed to a burglary gone wrong, but something about the scene felt off to Detective Evelyn Marshall, 43 years old, who was a seasoned investigator with a sharp eye for detail. She noticed the careful staging of the crime scene, the odd positioning of the broken glass. Her instincts told her that this was no ordinary burglary. As the investigation deepened, Detective Marshall began to uncover inconsistencies in the evidence. The careful staging of the crime scene suggested that someone had tried to cover their tracks, and yet there were small details that didn't add up. The splatter of blood beneath the desk, the fact that no fingerprints were found on the items that had been scattered around the room. These were not the signs of a typical burglary, but the more Detective Marshall dug, the more she uncovered. She discovered the remnants of Leona's surveillance system. Though Lucas had deleted the footage, he was unaware of the cloud backup that had automatically stored the last 24 hours of video. The footage showed Lucas entering the penthouse earlier that evening, but curiously there was no footage of him leaving. This discrepancy piqued Marshall's interest, leading her to dig deeper into Lucas's background. It was during this deeper dive that Marshall discovered Lucas's connection to the fatal car accident from his past. The incident, long buried, suddenly became relevant as Marshall pieced together Lucas's troubled history. She also noticed the blood speck on the underside of the desk, which matched Lucas's blood type. With these pieces of evidence, a new narrative began to form, one of a young man caught in a toxic relationship that spiraled out of control. But while the evidence was damning, Detective Marshall knew she needed more to make an arrest. She began to track down Lucas's acquaintances, trying to find anyone who might have seen or heard from him in the days following Leona's death. It was a difficult task. Lucas had been careful to stay out of sight, and his friends knew little of his whereabouts. But eventually, Marshall got a break. The breakthrough came when Isla Monroe, unaware of Lucas's involvement in Leona's death, mentioned to a mutual friend that Lucas had been acting strange lately. This information eventually reached Detective Marshall, who tracked down Isla for questioning. During their conversation, Isla unintentionally revealed key details about Lucas's relationship with Leona, details that Lucas had never shared with anyone. But the closer Marshall got to the truth, the more dangerous it became for Lucas. She began to piece together a timeline of Lucas's movements in the days leading up to and following Leona's death. It became clear that Lucas had been living in fear of Leona, trapped in a relationship that had turned toxic. The more she uncovered, the more it seemed that Leona's death was not a random act of violence, but the tragic result of a relationship that had spiraled out of control. Armed with this new information, Detective Marshall put out a warrant for Lucas's arrest. Lucas, believing his plan was foolproof, was caught off guard when law enforcement surrounded the cabin. He was arrested without incident, still in disbelief that his carefully constructed alibi had unraveled. But the arrest was only the beginning of Lucas's nightmare. The media frenzy that followed was unlike anything he had ever experienced. His face was plastered across every news channel, his name dragged through the mud as details of his relationship with Leona came to light. The story of the young, handsome actor and the powerful, controlling older woman was too sensational to ignore, and soon it was all anyone could talk about. But while the media focused on the sensational aspects of the story, Detective Marshall was more concerned with the facts. She meticulously pieced together the evidence, building a case that would hold up in court. The blood speck, the surveillance footage, Isla's testimony, it all pointed to Lucas as the perpetrator. But Marshall knew that proving Lucas's intent would be difficult. The defense would argue that Lucas had acted in self-defense, that he had been driven to the edge by Leona's controlling behavior. But Detective Marshall wasn't willing to let Lucas off the hook so easily. She dug deeper, uncovering more about Leona's past, her manipulative tendencies, and the way she had controlled Lucas. She found witnesses who could testify to Leona's erratic behavior, employees who had seen her fly into rages, and friends who had witnessed the slow unraveling of her relationship with Lucas. But while the evidence was compelling, Detective Marshall knew that it would ultimately come down to how well the prosecution could present the case. She worked closely with the district attorney, helping them prepare for the trial. They knew that the defense would paint Lucas as a victim, a young man who had been manipulated by a powerful older woman. They would argue that Lucas had acted in self-defense, that he had no choice but to fight back when Leona attacked him. But Detective Marshall and the prosecution were ready for the defense's arguments. They presented the evidence carefully, painting a picture of a young man who had been driven to the edge, but who had ultimately made the choice to kill. They showed the jury the blood speck, the surveillance footage, the evidence of Lucas's past. They called witnesses who testified to Leona's manipulative behavior, and they presented Isla's testimony, which revealed key details about Lucas's relationship with Leona. But despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Lucas maintained his innocence. He insisted that he had acted in self-defense, that he had been driven to the edge by Leona's controlling behavior. He claimed that he had never intended to kill Leona, that her death had been a tragic accident. But the jury was not convinced. After weeks of testimony and days of deliberation, they found Lucas guilty of involuntary manslaughter. The judge, taking into account Lucas's lack of prior criminal record and the unusual circumstances of the case, sentenced him to 20 years in prison with no possibility of parole for the first 10 years. But for Lucas, the sentence was just the beginning of his punishment. The guilt and shame of what he had done weighed heavily on him, and as he sat in his cell, he couldn't help but reflect on how close he had come to getting away with it all. If only he hadn't overlooked that one tiny detail. But in the end, Lucas knew that he would never be able to escape the consequences of his actions. The storm that had raged inside him, the storm that had ultimately led to Leona's death, was now his constant companion. The once confident, ambitious young man had been replaced by a broken shell, haunted by the choices he had made.